Welcome to this week's afternoon rant. I was going to do it this morning, but I went out for breakfast instead. There you go. And a very nice breakfast it was as well. But this week's rant is called high density, double density, or no density. And that will become clear in a minute. But first, if it looks a bit wet out there, and I look a little bit wet, the reason is I am a bit wet, and it is very wet out there. We're in the middle of Storm Clara, which is hitting the UK at the moment. Many areas are experiencing power cuts around me. In fact, actually, the local energy company, through their online application, says there are actually 72 in the area around me at the moment, which is sort of quite high. So we haven't lost power, or I haven't lost power here at the moment, but you know, I could lose power any minute, so I'm just going to crack on with this. But you know, you may hear sort of rain noises and wind noises that the microphone may pick up. So that's what it's all about, because it is a bit wet. And the reason why I'm a bit wet is because when I sat down to do this about an hour ago, I realised that I'd left the transmitter for the radio mic on when I packed it away last time, and the battery was as dead as a dodo. So I've had to quickly whip around the corner and get some new batteries, which meant I could go and get coffee, which was sort of a plus point. But as I got out of the car, the heavens just opened and I got rather wet. So that's my, it looks like I've just got out of the shower. I haven't just got out of the shower, but I just got wet. Anyway, moving on. First things this week, thank you to the 17 people who have subscribed to the channel. Last week I said we were at 1490. This week we're just over 1500. And 17 people have subscribed to the channel in the week, and very thank you, shout out to Gary, who sent out a supportive tweet earlier in the week. You seem to have done the trick, mate. You got me over the line. 1500 subscribers. I feel incredibly humble. I have felt incredibly humble for a while. So next target, 2,000 subscribers by the end of the year. Let's see if we can get there. Woohoo! Now, if I was good with the video, I'd have sort of fireworks coming out of my head at this point, but don't expect that. But so back to the reason why I'm doing the rant this week. High density, no densities, or double density, or something like that. So if you've been watching the channel for a period of time, you will know that one of the projects I've had undergoing for a while is the disk archive. And the disk archive is all about preserving the sound libraries that were issued by Roland and Korg and EMU and whoever else on floppy disks for instruments that I own. I'm not really doing anything for instruments I don't own, but for instruments I own, I've been sort of consciously collecting the disk libraries for a period of time. And the whole idea of it is to preserve the sound libraries that come on these disks. And what I'm talking about is these things, these 3.5-inch floppy disks that a lot of sounds were issued by the manufacturers and other software houses or sound houses, if you like, over a period of time for specific instruments. And I've sort of kind of seen a bit of an issue coming forward. So my idea for this was always that once the disk library was up and running, I would publish a list of all the disks, all the libraries I have, and from the archive. And if you needed one of those, then at cost of materials, you guys could, you know, effectively say, "Can you give me one of those?" And I would do. Now, the issue I've sort of kind of running into is going to affect the price of that. And the reason for that is that these things are starting to become short supply. So the format as we know it, this 3.5-inch 720 kilobyte format, and although the disk can take different amounts of data depending on how you format it, the general consensus is these are known as 1.44 megabyte disks, but that's not quite true. But the 3.5-inch disk in the format we know it was sort of pioneered by IBM in 1984, effectively as a way of either distributing programs or backing up data from their IBM PCs. That's the bottom line. A few years before that, HP and Apple had introduced this sort of plastic 3.5-inch format for their PC ranges. the former was 280 kilobytes in size, and the latter was 360 kilobytes inside. And the interesting thing about the Apple format, which was the 360 kilobyte, effectively it was this disk, but their machine would only read one side of it, so it was single-sided, not double-sided. Hence the reason why it was 360, not 720 kilobytes. You know, quirk of fate. IBM just put a second head into their disk drive. I suspect the reason Apple didn't put a second head into their disk drive, because at that point in time, second heads were expensive. But IBM put a second head into their disk drive, made it double-sided, and Bob's your uncle. We now have the 720 format. Now, this 720 format was known as double density, double-sided. Written quite often as DDDS on a lot of disk packaging, but that's effectively what it standing for. So effectively, it was a high density double-sided disk, 3.5-inch disk that could hold 720 kilobytes of data. Now, I know in these days you probably wouldn't get a sample that even fit on 720 kilobytes of data, but back in those days we did, and somehow methinks that we need to sort of think about some of the data we put onto things, and whether we're actually bloating the data, or bloating the samples, should I say, in some instances, because we can rather than because we should. But that's a different video completely from this one. 3.5-inch format replaced a 5.25-inch format, which was a specification that was the originally, especially if you watch things like War Games, that's the 5.25-inch format. In actual fact, in War Games, I think you see the 8-inch format, which has actually predated the 5.25-inch format. But they replaced each other, and the reason why they were called floppy disks, for one reason or another, is not really so much this, because this has this hard plastic case, although if you look inside, the disk is floppy. But the reason why was the 5.25 and the 8-inch disks had a plastic sleeve that was very flexible. You could literally do that with it. So it became known as the floppy disk. That's where the name came from. The 3.5-inch disc was effectively the sort of final incarnation, although there were things like quick discs that Roland played around with on the MKS 100. The MKS 100 had a quick disc format, which was a 2-inch format, not a 3.5-inch format. But this was sort of kind of the de facto standard, if you like, of disk storage around that time. Here's an interesting fact. The military still use 5.25 and 8-inch discs, and the reason why they still use 5.25 and 8-inch discs is because a lot of applications are siloed and they have no links to the outside world, and they were put in so long ago that it's very expensive to try and upgrade the hardware, especially bring the hardware online. So bringing the hardware online requires telecommunications, which means that you've got points of entry from a cybersecurity perspective. So a lot of military applications still use discs of things like 5.25 and 8-inch discs for shunting data around. So that's quite scary, isn't it, when you think about it? But a lot of those applications, when you put those applications in, I've said this before with legacy tech, you put the machine in, the machine works fine. But computing and the world of computing moves on so rapidly that these formats are being left behind, and nobody is really thinking ahead about this. You've also got industries like CNC machines, and a lot of CNC machines, they would take the CNC pattern on one of these things, and again, there's nothing wrong with the machine per se. The machine works fine. It's just the technology the machine is built on has been superseded by where technology now is. If you bought a machine nowadays, it'll probably be networked. Back in those days, and a lot of companies have them, they have machines that work perfectly well, but they require their instructions to be delivered on one of these things. Piece of trivia. And probably a good reason why these things are not, people are not manufacturing things, but we'll come on to that. So again, why is this relevant to legacy synthesizers? Well, depending on when your synthesizer was manufactured, your synthesizer will either be manufactured with one of these as the primary method of getting data in and out. This is a double-sided, double-density, double-sided disk. Or they were manufactured with one of these, which is the next incarnation, which was the high-density double-sided disk, which was double the capacity of that at 1.44 megabytes. Okay, but what your machine would either read one of these. Now, I can tell you the T1, the T series read these. The S series samplers read these. Now you start to understand some of the problems that are going to come in a sec. In order to read a high density disk, you need a high density disk drive. If you have a high density disk drive, pound to a penny, you can read a double density disk. If you have a double density disk drive, you can't read a high density disk. Okay, so if you had an older piece of equipment that has a double density disk drive, it can't read a high density disk. You can't swap the double density disk drive for a high density disk drive because the firmware in the machine won't recognize it. It won't operate it properly because it is expecting a track size, a track size of a certain width, and a high density has double the data on it, so therefore the track sizes are condensed and it's slightly different format. So one can't read the high density can read the double density, but the double density can't read the high density. I hope that is as crystal clear as mud. So, as I said, the mainstream computer industry has now moved away from this. So post 2006, you would struggle to buy a machine with a floppy disk drive on it because manufacturers are moving to portable media devices, CDR. CDR was the first one, and then sort of portable media devices started to come in. I mean, just as another side here, you could get a lot of data on an Apple iPod. Okay, if you use the iPod in data mode, and I used to use the iPod in data mode quite a lot, instead of storing songs on your iPod, you can actually store programs on your iPod and just import them backwards and forwards to your computer. I used to use that for documentation all the time when I was traveling. So my iPod doubled for two things for me. Number one, it was sort of my tunes while I was on the move, but it also was a documentation library of key documents that I needed to do my job when I didn't travel with my computer. So, and that was kind of before everyone got really upset about you plugging USB devices into the machines of companies. This was before those days. Which now means that computer manufacturers are not manufacturing the drives, they're not including the drives with their machines. So the disk drive manufacturers have stopped, or a lot of them have now stopped producing the disks. And this is where the problem starts, because not so much with the high density, because the high density still seems to be in good supply, but it starts to become a problem with the older machines. And I'm talking about, the EMU SP1200 was a double density format. The S series sampler is a double density format. The S750 is the operating disk for the S750 is a double density format. And I probably could go on if I sort of went through my disk library. But all these disk drives that are attached to these machines are double density. They're not high density. And that's where the problem is, because these things are becoming quite rare and they're becoming quite pricey. So the law of supply and demand starts to kick in at this point, in that they are becoming expensive to buy, which means that unfortunately, where my idea was to allow you to ask for these things at cost plus shipping, that cost is going to go up a bit. So I apologise in advance for that, but I'm just saying that if your machine is using one of these double density disks, I would suggest now that you look at the market space and see if you can buy a stock of these and stick in the cupboard, like I have just done. Because I think over the coming years, these things are going to become much, much harder to source. Now, if you operate some legacy computers, you may also be in the same boat as this. So this also goes out to people who are using Atari STs and Commodore Amigas, and I know two of my friends who use both. One uses one and one uses the other platform. Those computers use the 720 format disk, the double-sided, double-density disks. And I was having a chat with them middle of last week, I suppose, and they were saying that they were struggling to get hold of new discs. They were sort of going through their old disk library and working out what they could effectively scrub and reload. Now they do, both of them admit to me that they have like compact flash devices attached to their machines, which sort of kind of acts as a hard drive for them. But what they've said is that they still, when they're moving, I don't know, Steinberg data between them and friends, them and collaborators, they kind of use the floppy drives for that. Now you're probably turning around and saying, well, why aren't they using a modern stage door? And I'll tell you why they're not using a modern stage door. They don't need it. They have sequencing software that sits on the Atari platform or sits on the Amiga platform. That sequencing software is very simple to use. I have to be honest. I've played with it in the past, and they like using that sequencing software. And because they like using that sequencing software, they're not going to go anywhere else. They don't need a DAW for what they're doing. They can just write their songs in the sequencing software. Very simple. They're not concerned about audio tracks. They're not concerned about effect loops. They're not concerned about this, that, and the other. As far as they're concerned, that machine is operating as a hardware sequencer for them. And that's how they use it. MPC is another classic example. An MPC that will be using, the older MPCs will definitely be using the 720 format. The newer ones will definitely be using 1.44 megabyte format. But again, if you're looking for a hardware sequencer, the Yamaha Q series, the Roland's, I can't think what it is, but you sort of get the drift. A lot of these old machines are going to be using these discs, and that's what we sort of kind of need to be mindful of. Now, one of the things about these things, there is actually a way to fool a 720 drive or a faller drive into thinking it's reading the 720 disc, which I'll come on to in a minute. But the first thing you need to understand is how do you know that is a high density disc, apart from the fact that I've just told you? Well, it will come up here somewhere in greater detail, so don't worry about the fact that it's sort of a bit far away from the camera. This is a high density disc, okay, and what you need to do is you need to look at the disc with the shield at the bottom, like so. And if you look at the disc with the shield at the bottom, if you look up on this side, there is a hole. And if you can see all the way through that hole, okay, that disc is in read-only mode. If you turn the disc around, you will see there is a little black slider, which I have to do that. If you slide that down like that, and turn it around, you can no longer see through that hole. This is in read-write mode. Okay, simple mechanical mechanism for protecting the disk. Put it back to read mode. Okay, and both the high density and the double density have the same slot on this side. However, where they do not have the same slot is if I were to look at this one, you'll see on this one I have a hole on the other side, as you're looking at it at the moment, which will be your, so that's my left, it'll be your left, okay? This one here. That tells the disk drive that you have a high density disk. If you look at a high density disk, okay, there you go, hole on that side, no hole on this side, that's a double density disk, and that's how the disk drive recognizes between the two formats. If you've got a high density disk drive, it says, oh, I know this is a high density disk drive, therefore I have this certain track mapping. Oh, it's a double density disk, therefore it's a slightly different track mapping. Okay, that's how the disk drive does it. That's how you tell which one is which. Now the trick that you can use on some machines is you get a piece of tape and you block off, just put the tape around like that, and you block off that hole. And for some machines that will work quite well. That will trick the machine into thinking it's reading a double density disk rather than reading a high density disk, and it will format it as such. But some of the older stuff is finicky. It won't allow you to do that, so you have to go and you have to buy a proper double density disk drive or double density disk. Short and nasty bottom line is that floppy disks are going to become more expensive going forward if you can maintain supply. And if there are viewers out there that do know of suppliers that are holding supplies of these disks, if you can let me know, that would be great, because I would like to put some more in stock so that I have them to write the images to once I've duplicated the images into this library. Right, so that really is what this week's rant was all about. Now, a couple of things have turned up, and of course what I've done is I've put them over here, and then I've got to squeeze around the table to get over there. Well, I put one of them over here anyway, the other one's in the other room. So the first thing that turned up this week, which I've been searching for a couple of weeks actually, if I'm brutally honest, is this thing. Okay, this is the original TX16W version 2 operating system. Now, a lot of people will be turning around to me and say, well, you know, you can get Typhoon and what have you. And I say, yeah, well, you can get Typhoon. So why have I bothered to get the version 2 operating system disk? Well, the reason is because the Yamaha version of the software, which is what that disk is there, is actually far better at handling disk commands than Typhoon is. Hence the reason why I've gone for it, because I am doing a lot of things at the moment rotating to disks. Hence the reason for this week's rant. So because of that, I've got that. The other thing I've actually got is the owner's manual, the full owner's manual for the TX16W as well, which will probably now teach me where I'm going wrong in terms of my just blundering around the synthesizer to make things happen. I can actually read the operating system manual now to actually understand why the fact that I press that button, it doesn't work. But that, said the mayor, was that. So until next week, as they say in Star Trek Lang, and anyone who's now watching Picard, I think it's brilliant. Live long and prosper. Bye-bye.